Okay, picking up on the last tutorial on material creation, now we're going to talk about adding textures to your materials and the different types of textures that you can add. So we're just going to start with the first sphere that we were working with. And again, let's just double click on that material. It's going to pull up the properties, and under the material parameters, you also have this option here that says textures. So if you click on that, you can add a few different texture types. You can do color, specular, bump, and opacity. And we'll go through these just one at a time and explain what they do. So let's start with the color. And if we go to this folder here, I do have this wood texture set up. Now, this applied a wood texture here, and you can see that even though we're using the plastic material type, we've created something that looks like a fine wood. So one of the things I'd really like you all to understand is that even though this is the plastic material type, there's a variety of different materials that you can actually create with it. It's not limited to just creating plastics. You can do different kind of rubber materials, different kinds of woods, even leathers, and we'll go through and we'll create a few of those using our textures here. Now, the main thing you're going to want to ask yourself when you assign a texture, you're creating a material, like in this case, we're creating a wood. You want to ask yourself, is this actually reflective? And if it's not, you might want to turn your specular color down. Or you might want to have your specular color up, but you might want to start to introduce a little bit of roughness here to start to break up that reflection a little bit. So you still get some highlights going on, but they're not perfectly polished, perfectly reflective highlights. Okay. So if we turn this roughness back down, you can see how our reflections are getting nice and sharp. Now going back to that index of refraction property, if I start to increase this, you can start to simulate a little bit more of a clear coat on something like a wood. But again, be careful how high you take this, or you're going to start to simulate something that's a little bit more metallic, or it might not look too realistic. Okay. All right, let's remove this one for a second, and let's talk about the specular. I'm also going to take the roughness back down. Now, just by showing you the specular color and what that does, how that adds reflective areas, I want to go ahead and load a map in here and show you what that does. This is going to control what areas actually appear reflective, and the specular color essentially uses, or the specular map uses black and white values. So if I load an image in here that has black and white values, the white values are going to be 100% specular, the black values are going to be 0% specular. And so let's create a material that is a good example of where you might want to use that. So let's just load in the specular first. I have these tiles texture here. So let's load that in. And you can see what we've got going on here. Look where those reflections show and where they don't show. And let's take a look at that texture. So this is what we have. So all these black areas are basically telling the material that we're creating, don't be reflective here. All the white areas, it's telling it be 100% reflective. Okay. So let's load something else in with that that's going to make it a little bit more useful. If we grab a color texture here and set these tiles, now what we've got going on is a tile material that's reflective on the tiles and not where the grout is. Now whenever you're using multiple maps like a color and a specular and a bump, it's a good idea to go ahead and sync up your textures. When you do that, if you adjust something like the scale, both textures are going to adjust together. Okay. Now there's something else that we can do with this material to make it even more convincing. One thing we don't have is a bump applied. So a bump is also going to use something like black and white values to simulate a little bit more of a raised and lowered effect. So it's good for rendering small details that aren't really practical to model. So let's just load the same thing we have on our specular into the bump and just see what that does for us. we reduce the scale back down here and we take a look, you can see we're getting highlights now as if there's, actually raised and lowered, as if these tiles are higher up in elevation than the grout. And you can increase this effect by increasing the bump height. So there we were able to create a pretty realistic tile. And if we wanted to make it, say, more reflective, we could always come down here and start to boost this refractive index. And we get a little bit more reflections occurring on there. But keep in mind, the specular map is also telling this material, hey, don't render reflections right here where the grout is. And that's because the specular map is black in these areas. Okay, so let's go ahead and get rid of these textures for now. So we'll delete these. And let's talk about one other texture type, and that's going to be opacity maps. And so I'll just load one that happens to come with KeyShot. Let's find a good one here. Okay, so we have this mesh circular alpha. So what that's going to do is that's going to use black and white values to essentially render transparent areas on a material. So if I start to scale this down, you can see what we have is this material that has holes in it. So you can do things like circular mesh materials and stuff like that. You can also, still change the color of your plastic material, and that will update. Okay, so that's a quick look at the different texture types and what they do. And let's go ahead and just delete this for now. All right, so let's try and create another material type using the plastic. So in this case, let's go ahead and just create a leather. So keep the material type plastic, and let's go over to textures, and let's load in a color map. Here I have this leather, and that's assigned to our object. Now let's also just go ahead and load that same file in as a bump. Now there are better ways to go about creating a bump map using Photoshop from this color texture, but just for the sake of time, and if you're in a hurry yourself, this is better than not having any bump map at all. Now by default, the bump value on this, in this particular case, is a little bit too high. So we'll start to knock that back a bit. And again, let's make sure that sync is checked, because I'd like to reduce the scale of this, and I want both of these to follow. So we start to reduce this down, and maybe we can increase our bump height a little bit more, and maybe we can even add a little bit of roughness. Don't be afraid to use roughness in conjunction with a bump map. And also, our refraction index is still a little bit high, which is making this leather look a bit too reflective. So we can start to bring that down as well. Probably be more around the range of around 1.4. Okay. So as you can see, we were able to create a pretty convincing leather pretty quickly. Okay, so let's try another material with the plastic. This time, let's create something that's not reflective and polished. So under the textures, I'll just load in something else like plywood. Okay, and if we reduce the scale down, there's something else you can do with the scale. Notice how the knots in the plywood are stretched. So it seems like we would need to stretch them out vertically to get them to appear correct. So if we expand the scale option, we can edit the scale on the X and Y independently. Once I do that, if I collapse the scale option and adjust the scale, they do stay proportional to whatever I've set. Okay, so if this was plywood and it was not polished, I could do a couple different things, like increase the roughness, and that will start to diffuse out that reflection a little bit more. Or I could turn the specular down a little bit. So, and what it's largely going to come down to in a lot of these instances is what looks correct to you and the look that you're going for. You know, I definitely would encourage experimenting with all this stuff and really getting a feel for how it works. So let's go ahead and bring back some of our other materials. So we'll do show all parts here, and let's take a look at our metal, and let's do something with this. So if you look at the metal type and we look at the textures, you see it has color, bump, and opacity, but not specular. You're not going to be able to apply a specular map here because metals are essentially all specular. So let's reduce this roughness down, and let's change the color, just to a normal, say steel or chrome. It's like a mid-gray. And for the textures, let's load in a bump and see what sort of things we can create for that. Do have this metal scratches. And if I reduce the scale of this, you can see we can create a scratched metal. You can also increase the bump height, just like on the other one. And we could always add some roughness. And you can pretty easily create the look of a distressed metal. Okay, now let's take a look at the glass. And if we load in a texture on the glass, you can see we can only do bump and opacity. Opacity is probably going to look strange if you ever apply that, simply because glass has thickness, and the opacity maps are going to make it appear essentially infinitely thin. Okay, so let's go ahead and apply a bump map to this and see what we can come up with. I have this paper, and we can use these black and white values to create some sort of an effect, and it'll probably just appear like some sort of warped or rippled glass. And just like before, we can adjust the scale of our X and Y independently, and we can scale this down and maybe just increase that bump height. And we have this sort of rippled glass effect. Okay, let's move over here. Now this is the translucent material. Something that would be good to create using the translucent would be something like marble. So let's load in a different map here for the color, because marble does actually scatter light beneath its surface. So let's go here with, say, this marble texture. And I'm going to set this blend with color just to white. And for the subsurface color, let's knock back the saturation of this. Okay, there's something else I'd like to show you about working with textures, and that's essentially that you can do a blend with color. So we have this wood here, and what we can do, maybe we wanted to change the color of that wood, we could check this blend with color option, and we could start introducing some additional color in here. This is going to multiply this color value with the color value of your texture and give you a new color. So that's going to allow you to dynamically change colors of your materials with textures on the fly. So it's pretty useful, especially if you're doing something like creating a library of different colored leathers. You could essentially have one leather texture and then use this blend with color and create a whole variety of different colored leathers with that one leather texture. Now, there's another thing I'd like to talk to you about, and that's the mapping of your textures. Now, anytime you're dealing with textures in 3D, there's always going to be the issue of, okay, you have this 2D texture that needs to get projected onto a 3D object. And the 3D application needs to know how's it going to go about that. By default, the textures are going to be set to UV coordinates. And most of your CAD applications are not going to actually support UV coordinate creation. So in KeyShot, we offer these different projection types. You can do something like planar X, and what this is doing is that's projecting this texture along the x-axis, infinitely along the x. So if we orient ourselves along the x-axis, you'll see that it looks right. But if we go to the side, what's going to happen is we're getting this stretching occurring. That's because imagine we have our texture here and we're projecting it out into space. It's going to project infinitely through this object. And on the sides here, we're going to exhibit stretching because that texture is flat. And if we take a look here at the manual, this will help illustrate that for you. Under the texturing menu, we have this texture mapping. And this shows here, see, planar X. And you can see that it's projected along one axis, and then eventually you get this stretching. Same with planar Y. So it's going to project down from the top, and when you reach the sides, you're going to see some stretching. So let's take a look at that in action here. Let's change this to planar Y. And you can see from the top it looks great. And when you get around to the sides, you do have some stretching in your textures. And let's switch this to planar Z. Similar thing. So, on the sides it looks fine, and then stretches on the other areas. Now, to avoid the stretching issue, we have another mapping type called box map. And what box map does is it projects it from all sides of a cube. So imagine there's a cube surrounding this sphere, and each face of that cube has a texture map to it that it projects inward. Now that's great, and it will solve a lot of problems as far as stretching is concerned, but you will inherently get these seams. Okay, there's another option here, and that's spherical. And that's perfect for something like this particular object that is a sphere shaped. And you have cylindrical, which is great for putting labels on things like cans, bottles, anything like that that's cylindrical in shape. Now, each one of these automatic mapping types essentially have a mapping tool. So if we click on box map and click the mapping tool, we can position this texture with that mapping tool. You can adjust the scale of it and the rotation, and you can click the position button to position that somewhere on the model, and when you're happy with your positioning, you can click done. Now same thing with cylindrical. If we set this to cylindrical, try cylindrical on this one. And let's go to our mapping tool. So this is essentially what you'll have with the cylindrical. and it's going to be projected inward from the edges of that cylinder. Now you can also scale this. So you can see our texture is being stretched on whatever axis that we scale that on. And we can also rotate our cylinder projection. And this is going to be really useful for you if you're creating things like labels on bottles or cans. Because if you just orient this cylinder in the same direction as your bottle or can, it's going to orient that texture on that axis. Okay, so that's a look at working with textures.